This is the London Fintech Podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman, and this is London Fintech Podcast, episode 57, and I have the great pleasure to be joined today by Geoff Miller, CEO of Afaafa, former CEO of GLI Finance, which he built from having no presence in alternative finance to having some 20 stakes and loan agreements. A quick count on LinkedIn shows that Geoff has been on about 24 peer-to-peer and equity crowdfunding boards, which makes him the man in the world with more experience of alternative finance boards than anyone. For those many people on the London scene who know Geoff and have been trying to meet him, it explains why he's such a busy boy and hard to pin down, especially as those companies are geographically spread and he lives in Guernsey. If you are anywhere near the fintech scene in London or in some other countries, you will have heard of Geoff. Geoff has always been a rare soul in terms of brutal honesty. At AltFi Europe 2015, the general tone of which was rah rah, aren't we wonderful, brackets, that's hubris, isn't it, brackets. Geoff spoke of, quotes, woeful underwriting standards and hopelessly naive CEOs, unquotes. So who better to talk about the importance of corporate governance in alternative finance and fintech at large than Geoff? As Professor John Kay said in LFP057, corporate governance may sound like a dull box ticking exercise, but it's a vital function of financial services. Just look at what has happened to senior executive pay in the UK when the FS industry, now the largest holder as most of our investments are indirect, hasn't bothered to vote much at board meetings. If the cat is off busy making whoopee, it's hardly surprising if the mice steal most of the cheese. Geoff's an ideal guest on the London Fintech Podcast as he doesn't just have views and opinions, which are so prevalent amongst the so-called thought leader classes on LinkedIn. Rather, he has been at many coal faces with many miners, and as with coal mining, is often dirty and painful work. In LFP057, John Reagan gave an excellent account of managing one's way out of business model crisis at Platform Black. GLI Finance had its own internal shuffle before Christmas, bringing in new management. More recently, Funding Night went into administration. I described that incident to an insider on the London peer-to-peer scene as vulture capitalism, only to have the retort of perhaps that it's more like roadkill capitalism, another story for another time. Talking of the weak and vulnerable, Geoff is clearly a real philanthropist with a soft spot for the down and out as he supports West Ham United. Plenty to talk about, so let's get on with the show. Hi Geoff, thanks for joining me today.
Pleasure.
So, for those people abroad who are only familiar with the good football teams in the United Kingdom, they may not have heard of West Ham United, and they may not know that they wear pretty much claret and blue, which is the same colour as Aston Villa, who I used to support in my younger days.
That's true, and in fact Aston Villa is the reason that West Ham ended up in claret and blue, as the West Ham team won a bet with Aston Villa.
The West Ham team stole their kit 100 years ago.
Well, they won a bet for £100 and the Aston Villa team, rather than actually paying them in cash, paid them in kit.
Oh, so it was true then?
So, yes.
And that was £100 about 100 years ago, presumably?
Yeah,
wow,
correct.
That's a big bet.
Yes.
I thought any modern footballers sort of did that kind of thing.
Well, the West Ham team did slightly leg over the Aston Villa team in that it was a bet that one of their supporters could race faster than any of the Aston Villa team. What they didn't know was one of the travelling West Ham supporters was in fact an international athlete.
Ah, so there was a ringer there involved.
Yeah.
Useful advice all around. There's a MASH episode about that as well. So before we get into the excitement that is corporate governance and alternative finance, like many people in the modern world, you've had a varied career that's given you all sorts of experiences around the compass of financial services. So kind of where did you start off and how did the journey take you to where you are and where you're going next?
I was originally in fund management and specialising in financials, and spent 25 years as a fund manager and an analyst looking at financial services companies, and then went offshore to Russia originally and then to Singapore. And during my travels, I came across an offshore investment company, which was then called T2 Income Fund, which needed sorting out, was an externally managed vehicle, and I then took it by the scruff of the neck, was looking for something to do with it, and the peer-to-peer sector was just beginning to take shape back in 2011, and so realised that there was an opportunity to build something that would be quite interesting. But I'd come at it very much from a financial services background rather than a technology background, so perhaps had a slightly different approach to many of those that were coming in at the early stages. Hence, we had a slightly different approach to all of the sector.
And I've forgotten now, but you did tell me in the past some statistic in that the share price when you joined was, I don't know, 0.001 pence, and when you left it was much higher. I can't remember what the stats are.
Yeah, shareholders made about 10 times their money during my tenure as CEO.
Good. Okay, so for all those thousands of people listening, next time you see Geoff about to go somewhere, maybe you think, well, if you can do the same again. And just before we go on to the exciting matters of corporate governance, so when were you in Russia and Singapore? I mean, the years, something like Russia and slightly Singapore, the years one there really does affect the experience quite a lot.
Yeah, I moved to Russia at the beginning of 2008, so caught the very end of the boom. And then from the beginning of August 2008 through the following 3 months, the market then fell 80%. So I was working for a Russian investment bank, which was fantastic for the first few months, and then
Not so fantastic,
and really saw the brutal side of what Russians will do when they see a financial crisis, cutting heads, but also cutting everyone's salary across the board. And it was a very difficult place. We then moved to Singapore in end of 2009, beginning of 2010, and couldn't be more different.
Yeah. Well, it's somewhat authoritarian, of course. The central powers that be have got a clear idea of what will happen, and it does happen.
Yes. And it's very interesting to actually see, particularly the younger generation's view. My wife was at INSEAD doing an MBA in Singapore, and to actually hear people's view that actually perhaps this authoritarian type approach was the way to deal with the modern world, which for those of us who are slightly older found slightly alarming, that actually the conclusion that people come to in seeing chaos in America and Europe is perhaps the Singapore model is one to go for.
Yes, I think the thing about the Singapore model is that for all the sort of nice wishy-washy liberals, it's actually quite hard to say that a kind of Confucian authoritarianism hasn't worked, because it has. I mean, we're talking slightly before about the sort of Channel Islands, before we were recording the Channel Islands and Brexit and all that kind of stuff, and they've certainly got their challenges. If you read the history of it, and actually I quite like Lee Kuan Yew's book, funnily enough, I didn't suddenly agree with everything he said, my large part, but they were in real trouble when the British pulled out of Malaya.
Yep.
And then Singapore left Malaya and became on its own. It was just a sort of a naval base with bugger all there. They turned that around massively over the decades.
They had nothing other than huge amounts of corruption, and the reason the Brits didn't want it was because it was just seen as a liability, and he was on the steps of Parliament and crying his eyes out saying we're on our own, and pulled it all together. I think if you take Singapore and Russia together, though, it's interesting to see the difficulties that can happen. That in Singapore it sorted out endemic corruption, whereas in Russia it's embedded corruption, which comes back to corporate governance.
I was wondering how I was going to get it back. Thank you for rescuing the podcast from far more exciting matters. But no, absolutely. I mean, I think, the difference is clearly that Singapore is a city-state, and a bit like Athens or Sparta back in the day, or Venice or whatever, you can rule something which you can roughly see from the sort of top of the highest building in one way, but when you've got a vast empire that spans continents, then like Russia, then it's rather difficult, and it's been rather different for the sort of Tsars as well. So that leads very nicely, very smoothly. I wish I'd designed that myself, actually. I'm too honest. I should have just taken credit for that. Into corporate governance, and just in terms of my prejudices, certainly back in the day, corporate governance meant you had some non-execs on the board who were sort of soft, friendly people who you might have a little drink with now and then, all that kind of stuff, and they didn't know very much and they didn't sort of interfere very much, all that kind of stuff. But occasionally there was a crisis and the chairman changed or the CEO changed, and at which point they'd all sort of start playing politics. So it was all a little bit soft and informal. I think I'm doing that system down because there were a lot of advantages to having sort of friendly people on the board like that. And then we had this whole kind of corporate governance, capital C, capital G, came into FS as a whole. And like most of these things, it just went into massive excess. This is my personal opinion, I'm not saying this is true, but from my perspective, it went into massive excess, and folks that I know on FTSE 100 boards and all that, You turn up and you've got sort of 6 inches or sort of 10, 12 centimetres thicker reports, and they're just flicking through it, and it's all bloody box-ticking exercises. And so maybe it was too soft at the beginning, maybe it's just like everything else, too much sort of regulated and box-ticking-y now. So that's the kind of prejudice I have about FS. In terms of, again, just my prejudice, and then we can actually sort of get into your proper explanation. My prejudice about Fintech as a whole, the problem with Fintech as a whole is that corporate governance is by and large entirely absent. It's pretty sort of disastrous. Now, people will say it is present because there are boards and they meet and they have meetings and all that kind of stuff and minutes and yada, yada, yada. But in practice, too many boards in Fintech are made up of the founders and the angels/VCs who put money in there. And surprise, surprise, everybody wants to kick the ball in one direction down the pitch. And it's very easy in those circumstances to not look over your shoulder and go, hang on, the roof's leaking, or something like that. So that's where I'm coming from. But as I say, the main advantage of having you, Geoff, is that you've sat on many, many boards, and the purpose of this podcast isn't to go into individual tales and telling tales out of school about what happened on this board or that board, but more importantly, to draw a number of lessons from your actual experience at coal faces of why corporate governance isn't some boring crap, but actually why it's something that's really important to building a strong, long-term company that's in the benefit of the shareholders, the management and society at large. And you've given me sort of 5 categories here, which I'll just go through sort of briefly to give people a little bit of understanding, which sort of roughly are independent oversight, secondly experience, thirdly contacts, fourthly dealing with issues, and fifthly, I can't read my writing. How structure something.
How structured the boards?
Oh, how structured, yes. Whether it goes into being too soft or too hard. So starting with the independent oversight, we've got listeners around the world. So what boards are varies around the world. We've got a new Prime Minister over here who's just had a coronation, Ms May, and she was certainly in her campaign speech, and her campaign lasted about half a day, talking about perhaps that maybe the UK should introduce 2-tier boards or worker representation, all of these sort of strange and weird continental things. Maybe she was going to figure that fairly sort of rapidly. But there are different models, coming back to Russia and Singapore and Germany and the UK, there are different models of corporate governance. Maybe I want to start with that. I mean, what does the phrase corporate governance mean? Does it mean different things to different people?
It clearly means different things to different people. From my perspective, I think the importance is to actually hold the company accountable and to look after the interests of the company, not necessarily the shareholders or the staff, but look after the company as a whole. So the board is responsible for the company, and that brings with it certain responsibilities and certain structures that are necessary.
So just pressing pause there. So for people who haven't experienced this kind of level of thing, and I'd agree with your model, the board is there looking after the company. The management are responsible for the day-to-day execution of the strategy as agreed with the board.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So if you're working in companies, and many companies are vast in scale these days, so you may never get anywhere near the board, what you see is the day-to-day management. But sitting on top of all that is something, let's using your phrase, looking after the company per se.
Yeah, and holding the management accountable for that day-to-day running of the business and setting the strategy of the company as a whole. And hence, there's certain things that the board will bring to the party, and if structured correctly, can really add value to the business. I think independence is important. I've always wanted to see a board which is diverse, and I know diversity is a topic which gets a lot of people very heated, thinking that it's about putting a token
United Colours of Benetton kind of board, yes.
However, I think it's important to avoid just having people, all of whom think the same, because then you're just going to get into groupthink and you're no better off than actually having the management running the business. You need to have people who are not afraid to express a dissenting point of view, to challenge what's actually being said by the management. Otherwise, you're not actually properly holding the management accountable. It's something which management teams sometimes mistake for a board being difficult, but it's actually an important part of the decision-making process. You should be able to justify your decisions.
Absolutely. So that's a very good one. So, let's say, imagine that I'm a sort of chief executive of a company and I'm very busy managing it every day and I'm doing a good job and yada, yada, yada. And, every month I've got a board meeting and talking to plenty of people in London the last couple of years who've got this kind of thing. Sometimes, I've got a board meeting this afternoon, they say it like that. sometimes, oh my God, I've got a board meeting this afternoon. It's a bit it's slightly less attractive than going to the hygienist, the dentist.
And there will always be an element of that. You've got to, as a chief executive, to be held to account, and it should be something which requires some decent amount of input as chief executive. If it's a walk in the park, then the board's not really doing their job, because you're going to get a situation, as we had with the banks over here, where the board is largely there to congratulate the CEO on being such a clever chap, rather than actually saying, does this really make sense, what you're going?
And tick a whole bunch of boxes just so they can all prove they were doing their duty and they're never going to be sued and, yada, 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 and all that kind of stuff. So one of the key angles there, and I'm sure you've seen a number of different models in your various experiences, is what kind of topics, shall we say, is that reserved for the board? I mean, how low down do they go? Just taking an example of the US Constitution. I mean, in my lifetime, the US president seems to have decided they've got the ability to declare war, so keep doing it left, right and centre. But if you go back a bit, like taking notable things like the Second World War, they had a hell of a job and certainly didn't believe they could, and they had to persuade Congress and all that kind of thing. So how is the average sort of board made out in terms of what the management is allowed to get on with? Like, they can buy a new photocopy without the board's permission, they can expand into France without the board's permission, or, how are these sort of boundaries defined? Because without that, reasonable men and women can differ over, actually, no, this isn't a topic for the board, Geoff. I've sorted that out, I bought the photocopier, or I've expanded into France.
I think it's an important area, particularly with earlier stage companies, that I've seen instances where there are too many matters reserved for the board, where the CEO has had to come to the board to discuss too many appointments of not senior executives, but kind of the next layers down, where really the board shouldn't be getting involved in making any sort of decision and can't really add any value. They need to be responsible for the big strategic decisions, because they need to be things that are carefully considered, and they need to be able to ask sufficient questions that they can ensure that, particularly relevant within alternative finance, things like ensuring that standards are being maintained and that they're not building up the sort of conflicts of interest that we've seen in people like Lending Club.
Yes. But actually, the one word we didn't talk about, Geoff, is independent. Now, I wonder what independent actually means, because if you've sat on the board for a few years, you all kind of know them, everyone fairly well, and you become, quotes, less independent.
Yeah, and that's where the box tickers perhaps would disagree with what you or I would consider as independent, in that, as you say, once you've been on the board for a number of years, you get to a point where you're no longer deemed independent. My view would be, just as with diversity, it should be a matter for the board, that you need a board which is truly independent-minded as a whole, but how you achieve that shouldn't be down to, is an investor independent? Well, I've seen investors who have been able to sit on a board and regard that as completely independent of their position as a significant investor. Equally, I've seen investors sitting on a board that have been unable to actually take any decisions which are actually anything other than entirely for their own benefit. So it's something that really, from my perspective, should be something that the chairman of the board should be ensuring, that the board is truly independent.
I think I'd entirely subscribe to that. I mean, people make up rules because we live in a machine world where everything's trying to be turned into a machine, and there's this illusion of control with a whole bunch of rules. But I'm just thinking back to when I chaired the Fixed Interest Fund Management Committee. I deliberately had some guy on there who was one of the family, who was a stroppy guy. He disagreed with everything I ever said, and on the equity side, they didn't have that. They all had this, all agreed with each other, and of course their performance was rubbish. And at least I had somebody there, when I was convinced the dollar was going up, who presented the other side of the opinion that was incredibly valuable. He was there for years. He was a stroppy sod for years, but that was kind of his thing. And I'm sufficiently self-confident to cope with that. So as you say, it doesn't actually really matter how long somebody's been there. I mean, you could turn up on the board of the London Fintech podcast tomorrow and be some nice guy and be just nice and friendly to me all the time, pat me on the back and that. Or you could turn up and be this stroppy sod who says, well, actually, Mike, shouldn't you be doing one in France, or yada, yada, yada. So I like the idea that it's a function and a responsibility of the chairman to ensure that there is a diversity of person input, whatever, in a real sense, rather than sort of, ticking the boxes. So coming on to the second of the advantages of corporate governance then, is that for the company you're bringing in experience. How have you seen that sort of play out in practice?
Everyone has a certain degree of experience. If you've got broad experience from a wide variety of industries, or from, in some cases I've seen it from the public sector. You're able to bring in various snippets from other experiences that you've had that are particularly useful when it comes to earlier stage businesses, because you have probably seen a number of the teething problems that companies go through, and perhaps in very different guises. They may not even be financial services companies or technology businesses, but you will have seen the same sort of dynamics playing out, and you're able to bring that experience. In addition, there's an awful lot of technical experience. My wife was dealing with a matter on options, for instance, the other day on one of the boards that she sits on, that she was able to use her experience from other option schemes which she's seen in the past, which that particular board probably didn't have the requisite experience elsewhere, and probably would have put something together that may not have been entirely suitable for their purposes and not achieve what they wanted to achieve, were they not able to bring in the experience from elsewhere.
Yes, that's interesting, and I hadn't particularly thought of it so much along those lines, but this is kind of something that would appeal to chief executives or the people who've set up businesses in terms of having more breadth of experience, because by and large, turkeys don't always vote for Christmas unless someone sort of forces them to. And by and large, people don't want independent non-executives criticising them or potentially pushing them out of the companies or all these kind of things. However, on the other side, if alternative finance is to grow, and we're recording this in 2016 after all the lending problems and a whole bunch of slowdown of institutional capital and yardy funding like falling over. And I think if they're to grow in the next phase, they do need to learn some lessons that have been learnt in all countries around the world over centuries. And I think one of the most attractive things is experience, for the sake of argument. I could be the good cop, you could be the bad cop. If you and I joined some random peer-to-peer board tomorrow that we're not on, you could imagine that we bring some different angles and all that kind of stuff. And, going back to the breadth, I very much relate to the breadth comment. So I enjoyed the podcast with John Reagan and talking about how you deal with crises in general. We started that off with the usual chit-chat, but we started off with chit-chat about his round-the-world sailing when the water maker bust 5 days from now. That's a real crisis. It's not just, oh dear, there's a board meeting, da-da-da-da-da, something financial's going on or political or whatever. This is, no, we're all going to run out of water.
But also, I think when it comes to a crisis, what experience can also bring to the table is identifying a crisis earlier than the management, because they don't actually realise that they're heading off a cliff, and bringing to the management's attention what the issue that they're going to be facing that they don't realise at the moment is, but also being able to help identify those key areas that are the important areas. Because when you're a management team, quite often when things are going wrong, you don't have the perspective to actually understand what are the really critical areas. I mean, I've seen things that have gone wrong in the past where the management team were unable to realise, no, forget the immediate problem. Actually, that's not the real problem. The real problem is something which to you appears quite small and insignificant, but actually, when the outside world looks at that, this is the real issue. Which it comes back to some of the issues at Lending Club were things that the management team didn't actually really think were that important, and may not have thought that the outside world would see as important because they were relatively small. However, from a corporate governance perspective, they were quite huge and needed to be sorted out, and ultimately cost the CEO his job.
Yes, it's another story entirely, because of course, in terms of PC and genuine experience, the Lending Club board had a hell of a lot. Some of the Wall Street so-called titans were there, so it's not like the people who don't know now.
But I think that's the reason why they actually took the action they did, because they actually did something about it. I think in other circumstances, they would have given the CEO a rap over the knuckles at the board meeting and carried on, where actually that would have been entirely the wrong thing to do and would have stored up problems for the future for themselves.
Yes, and then moving on to the third one, which is contacts. In the last episode, LFP056, with Rob Moffat from Balderton, he was talking about how very valuable it is having nice VCs on your board, because let's say you need something done in options or something. They will probably know somebody or another company or another CEO you can talk to, and yardy. Is there anything that needs adding around this context area?
In my view, it's important, because you can bring in, I had an instance recently with somebody that was looking at passporting into Europe, where I was able to ping an email to a CEO of a large alternative finance business who I knew had been in the business of passporting into Europe, and was able to get an off-the-cuff response as to exactly what you can do from the UK. Obviously E&OE, but it gave us effectively an informal view. I think importantly though, it's not something that should be the entire reason that somebody is on a board, because you see things such as political appointment, which supposedly open up all sorts of contacts.
I saw, for example, it's not to be controversial, it's just to report the news, Goldman Sachs recently appointed Barroso, the former head of the European Union. Maybe he has some useful contacts.
Yeah. So I think it shouldn't be the be-all and end-all, but it can be something which can really add value, particularly to an early stage company that might not be able to get into a big city law firm and get a free view, or get a large accountancy firm to work for them without that introduction being made, as well as I think it will become increasingly relevant to alternative finance businesses getting the opening of channels for capital, whether it's from banks or from elsewhere, that comes from some of your non-executives.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the definitions I like of an entrepreneur is that an entrepreneur is somebody who identifies and organises resources, and in that context having someone with a whole bunch of contacts and a real network is incredibly helpful. So the fourth one, dealing with issues. As I mentioned before, you've sat on enough boards with enough issues now to recognise what an issue is. So are there any sort of lessons from all that?
Yeah, I think it's where having a strong and independent board really comes into its own, and a board that actually understands what its responsibilities are. It allows the company to be dealt with independent from the management team. There will be times when it means that what the board has got to do is to replace a management team, and the board has got to be prepared to step in to a company. I've had instances where I've sat as chairman of a company as a non-executive, but then had to step in to act as CEO temporarily whilst we appointed a new CEO. That's something that the chairman of the board always needs to be prepared to do. I have seen instances where other companies have had boards which have run away from that responsibility. But also it allows that perspective when you have got an issue to be dealt with, that the board can sit back from the crisis and actually look at what needs to be done and make sensible decisions, which if the management just simply do the firefighting, they're not necessarily going to do the right thing.
Yes, I think that's very true. I was just pausing because I'm thinking of sort of the various crises that I've seen over the decades, one way or another, and this kind of almost dispassionate objectivity is essential. It's a bit like in triage or something in some battlefield. I mean, the doctors will run around quite quickly, but they won't start bursting into tears, panicking or whatever. Whereas actually, if you're on the battleground, you know, the adrenaline's up and you're running around trying to drag the half-dead bodies of your mates off and that kind of stuff.
Yes, and you have to be able to deal with it without any thought for what it means for your own personal position. I have seen management teams who are then just trying to look after themselves in that sort of circumstance. You really need to be dispassionate about it and just make logical decisions.
Absolutely, and sometimes you have to man up and do the right thing. And I'm thinking of an example where I was a non-executive on a board in various circumstances, and I made it very clear that I thought this absolutely had to happen. It didn't happen, and I said, well, thank you very much, good luck, and I stepped down. Whereas, again, going back to some sort of softer approaches, there are some people, and in FS these days, you're very well paid for being a non-exec on a big bank or something like that. The tendency is to sort of shut your mouth and carry on. Well, we just had the Chilcot report about terrible war, killing 1 million people or whatever it did, and all this kind of stuff, and there are loads of people who sort of shut up and carried on and took the salary, and I'm sure that some of those now rather wonder whether they should have.
Yeah, and I guess this is the one difficulty that you have with the board structure, is that if things really do go in the wrong direction, as a director, the only course of action you have to take if the rest of the board is determined to go in the wrong direction is to resign.
Yeah, it's like being a cabinet minister.
Exactly, because you're taking joint responsibility. It's not something which is necessarily understood by investors all the time. I have heard even activist investors that have talked about how a director should have a dissenting opinion on a board, and I've had to try and point out there is no such thing as a dissenting opinion. There may be a dissenting opinion within the board, but actually the board as a whole is responsible for every decision that's made by the board. So if you can't sign up to the decision, you have no choice but to resign.
Yes, it's a very tricky situation because whilst everything you say is true, I'm also talking of Russia, of Russian history, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, so I've forgotten who it was now, but one of them walked out of a congress of the Communist Party in protest over something, and the others, who obviously were actually thinking about it, must have been the Bolsheviks. The others said, right, okay, we're in charge. They've effed off. And that's it. So in a sense, you can get the situation where, let's say there's 2 or 3 people on a board, and they are the forceful people who aren't the sort of the yes men/women. If they all leave, then it's almost coming back to your duty to the company. It's almost actually negative for the company because, again, thinking of another board situation I've been in, the chairman left and then the non-executives took up the mantle of that. We need a new chairman, and the chief executive didn't want to get a chairman because he was basically sort of being autocratic, and then the non-executives left. And actually what happened, it just continued, and then there's no voice on the board. So that's the counter-argument. It's not 100%, 0%.
You're absolutely right. And in fact, there was the reverse process in Germany that the communists walked out of the Reichstag, leaving Hitler and his cronies in control. So there is this difficulty, but ultimately you have no choice but to go if you really can't influence what's going on. From my perspective, the important thing there, and it's not something which is done presently, but I think should be, is that the regulators of financial services businesses should be interviewing all of the directors that are standing down. And it's not something which needs to be a lengthy process necessarily, because if people are quite happy to say, no, everything was fine, but there should be an avenue, because effectively, in many cases, it's the only course of whistleblowing that the non-exec has.
Yes.
And whilst it may alert investors to an issue, they can't talk to investors about the issue because the matters within the board are confidential. And
as I was saying at the outset, on many boards these days, banks own the shares, banks sit on the boards, and yada, yada, yada. And by and large, in the economy, shareholders haven't been taking an active case, and executive pay has gone through the bloody roof on sort of FTSE companies and all that kind of stuff as a result. So it's a situation, I think, where more thought is required, and I think it's a very constructive idea that the regulator should do that, and the regulator should be responsible on large banks, and when they get around to looking at P2Ps in a bit more detail, for understanding the dynamics of how the board works at, say, rate setter, market invoice, and Zopa, to understand what they're like. Oh, well, actually, that's quite consensual, and there's always a bit of a bust up there, or at least they've got opinions and that kind of stuff. So in terms of the last point, regulation is a good lead-in to that. We do have this issue of how structured things need to be. Very simplistically put, I think that the story of Goldilocks was a good one. The porridge shouldn't be too cold or shouldn't be too hot, but that's a little cliche, little story. I don't quite know how that's actually achieved in practice. Or using another metaphor, gas has no structure whatsoever. It's completely random molecules in a solid. There's lots of structure, but none of the molecules are actually moving, whereas something sort of in between that's a bit more sort of fluid and liquid can have the right dynamics. Yeah. Do you want to stop me doing metaphor first here?
I think you're absolutely right that you want to be having a structure which is not too structured initially. I mean, there's nothing worse with a startup having a board sitting down and saying, right, okay, who's going to be the chairman of the audit committee and the remuneration committee, because it's completely pointless because you haven't got a business yet. But equally, when it comes to having a developed financial services business, and as some of the alternative finance businesses really start to grow, they need to make sure they've got the requisite committees, and they are managing things like the risk committee in an appropriate fashion. Having headed up risk committees in the past, I know it's something which needs to be taken very seriously and needs to be chaired by an independent non-executive.
Absolutely, and to my shock, I suspect that the majority of fintechs, even well-known fintechs in London, do not have an independent guy on the board looking at the risk.
Correct.
To me, that's shocking. To me, that means that they're going to fuck up. because there ain't nobody like you and me who says, look, that's cool, well, and I'm great you're doing that, but look over here.
It comes back to accountability. You've got to hold the company's management accountable.
Absolutely. So then just wrapping up, briefly, how do you think all this is going to happen? So, I mean, I completely agree with you. I think a lot of the thoughtful listeners will agree with the majority of what you say. As always, people can differ on sort of, some of the detail or some of the prescriptions. But one of the reasons we're having this podcast, and I've mentioned you many times on previous podcasts, about trying to pin you down and come on and talk about this, because I think it's essential for moving forwards. The fact that this is happening and it's an important conversation means that actually corporate governance isn't what it should be at the moment. So how is it going to come about? Are people going to listen to this and go, oh yes, we're converted? Are the regulators going to beat the crap out of them? Are the VCs going to?
I think the regulators and the VCs will gradually insist that they have the right structures. And it's an evolutionary process. Clearly, if you can get away with winging it, then a lot of people continue to do so. But in reality, now we're in a phase in which people have really got to justify what they're doing and address the concerns that people have. Having proper corporate governance around your structure makes it easier for investors, will give comfort to the regulators, and ultimately should significantly reduce the probability that you're going to end up screwing the business.
Absolutely. And one would hope that VCs and experienced angel investors would themselves say, you're a more attractive investment proposition if you have decent corporate governance. And by the way, who's the sort of independent guy coming along and saying, yeah, it's all going wonderful, but
yeah,
and that kind of stuff. So moving on then, and just wrapping up, I mentioned at the outset that you're CEO of Afaafa, which I must say, in my ignorance, I hadn't come across before. I guess I should start by asking, how's the corporate governance on Afaafa, then maybe sort of follow up briefly by what Afaafa is and what it does. And hopefully you're going to shoot yourself in the foot at this moment and say there isn't much corporate governance on Afaafa, but we must get around to it.
Naturally, inevitably, it's the investment company that my wife and I set up. As it's a small business, we don't have much in the way of formal structures as yet.
You have the appropriate amount of corporate governance and structure at the stage, and you have plans in the future too.
Yes, it's an investment company which has a number of stakes in alternative finance businesses, which we set up 3 years ago. Now I've left GLI. I'm taking a hands-on approach to it, doing some consulting work through it for other alternative finance businesses, and the plan is for this to be the main vehicle through which I do investments and consulting in the future.
Excellent. Well, I wish you every success in that, Geoff, because clearly you've got a huge amount of experience, and you've been on both sides of the sword, as it were, and seen it in the round. Mixing my metaphors again today. But this kind of stuff, I'm convinced, and many people are, is absolutely essential. It's a key to fintech moving forward to the next level, to becoming more grown up, to becoming less of a sort of 14 and 15-year-old and more of a sort of 19-year-old and 20-year-old, where you need to buckle down and do a whole bunch of stuff like occasionally eat your greens and go to the gym and that kind of thing, which didn't seem to matter so much. And I think people are very well aware, even if they're not actually actioning it at the moment, maybe it'll take a couple more crises to make them to it, they're very well aware that this is somewhere where fintech is a long way behind financial services in terms of board composition, all this kind of stuff. And as I said at the outset, I generally believe that financial services has gone too far in the direction of rules, regulations and box ticking, and we don't want fintech to go like that. But equally, fintech porridge is perhaps a little cold at the moment and needs warming up. So thank you very much for that, Geoff, and I wish you every success in the future.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe on iTunes or your podcast app, or sign up at londonfintechpodcast.com for email alerts and new episodes. Live long and prosper.
We could sit in a bend there all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moon ride, watching a happy moon ride. Come away from the city, with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city, faces so grey with the pain of the everyday. We are wild like the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? We fit in between the earth and the sky. Kiss the city goodbye. Wave the city goodbye. Wave the city goodbye. Wave the city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me. 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 Watch the firelight dance.